Family felt like a shelter, a place where storms couldn't reach me. But one night changed everything. The warmth I counted on turned icy, smiles faded into shadows, and the walls that held us together began to crumble silently. A simple gathering twisted into a confrontation where words cut deeper than any wound, and the people I trusted became strangers in an instant. This story is about the moment when everything familiar slips away and leaves only questions behind. If you want to walk this path with me, please like and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Tell me where you're watching from and what family means when it breaks apart. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm listening. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks hovered. Even the old clock on the mantel seemed to stall, the second hand stuck between ticks. Clara's emerald dress caught the light, jade fire against winter, and her mouth curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. "We've discussed it," she said, voice bright enough to pass for cordiality to anyone who didn't know her. "We voted. Dad, you're no longer a member of this family. You need to leave this house." My first instinct was to laugh, because the words were so absurd they bounced off the walls like a bad theater line, but no one else laughed, not even the kids at the far end who knew how to giggle at the wrong time. Then the sentence unclenched and showed its teeth. Byron, her husband, drummed two fingers on the stem of his glass and let a smug half-smile bloom. The sort of look you see on a man who believes the verdict is read and the sentence carried out. A cousin gasped. My brother-in-law, Calvin, shifted in his chair, eyes darting from me to Clara to the door like a man mapping escape routes. The room remembered to breathe only in shallow puffs. I set down my knife with care, as if any sudden movement would set off an alarm. The heat from the roasted potatoes had fogged the rim of my plate. If I stared long enough, I could still see Foster leaning in, cracking a joke about holiday truces and burnt gravy, but Foster was gone, and the truce had been replaced by a tribunal. I could have argued then. God knows the ledger in my head was long enough and rattled off the tally. Tuition checks, emergency car repairs, down payments, rent-free years beneath this roof. I could have asked when gratitude had been declared obsolete, why every no I said to a luxury was twisted into a personal attack. But experience had taught me something far more useful than righteous speeches. Silence, used properly, is a lever. I reached down beside my chair, fingers closing on the plain beige folder I'd staged under the linen before the first toast. The paper was cool, the edges crisp, the weight just right, like a tool taken from a kit you've kept in perfect order. I stood only enough to extend it to her. "A parting gift," I said quietly. Byron's drumming stopped. Clara arched an eyebrow in bemused triumph, as if the folder were an apology wrapped in manila. She slid a manicured finger under the flap and flipped it open. The room leaned in without moving. She scanned the first page. The light in her eyes blew out. A candle pinched between wet fingers. "What is this?" she said, but the question lacked aim, coming out flat and breathless. Byron tilted his head, reading over her shoulder. His jaw tightened. His hand found the stem again, but he didn't drum this time. He gripped. I took a sip of water, slow, unhurried, a man cooling soup, and looked past them at the family photos lining the wall. No one glowed or laughed in those frames anymore. The laughter had been spent before dessert. "It's paperwork," I said, letting calm sit heavy in my tone. "The kind you only need when people mistake your patience for permission." Clara flipped another page, then another, each turned sharper than the last. She began to shuffle the stack, as if rearranging order would rearrange reality. "You can't be serious," she managed, shooting daggers that glanced off me and stuck in the drapes. "On Christmas," Byron finally spoke. "This is Petty Wallace. He said my name the way a man says a stain won't come out. I let my eyes rest on him. This is preparation." I replied. A concept you may find useful in the near future. Murmurs rippled from the far end. Cousins, neighbors, the couple from down the street who had been invited for the spectacle of community. The chandelier's light seemed harsher now, showing seams and fingerprints on everything. I remembered Foster's hand steadying mine the first Christmas after the diagnosis. How we'd agreed the best armor is truth delivered without heat. I breathed that memory in and felt the armor settle. We voted, Clara repeated, as if saying it again would make it more legal, more holy, more anything. We decided. Clara, I said, not raising my voice, not lowering it either. You don't get a vote on reality. Not in this house. Not tonight. Not ever. She looked around for backup that had shifted 2 chairs away. Calvin cleared his throat but found no words. Anise bit her lip until it blanched. Someone's phone buzzed and died to silence. Fire popped in the grate. Even the turkey's skin crackled like a whisper. I did not gloat. I did not scold. I held the line the way you hold a level, making sure the bubble stayed centered. If you believe I'm not part of this family, I said, then this will all make sense soon. She hissed a tiny laugh, all edge and no humor. You really think paperwork changes anything? The edge of the folder cut a small crescent into the tablecloth as she pressed down, unconsciously carving proof she'd been here. Yes, I said. It changes everything when the story people tell about you no longer matches the record. Byron opened his mouth, closed it, then chose a different tack. This is emotional manipulation, he announced to the table, scanning for nods. It's theatrical. No, I said. Theatrics is what you did standing up to cast me out. This, I nodded at the folder, is logistics. I reached for my glass again and let the stem cool my fingertips. I had been a man who worked overtime to pay for football camps and replacement transmissions, and one last semester when scholarship fell through. I had been the man who painted this dining room himself after Foster couldn't climb a ladder anymore. And I had been a man who assumed those memories would be stronger than convenience when money got tight. That assumption had died a month ago, quietly, in the shadow of a shopping cart full of things no one needed. I set down the glass and gave the room a small, almost apologetic smile, the kind you offer a crowd before the curtain rises. Because that's what this was, an opening scene, not the final one. If they wanted ceremony, I would honor the form. I would give them a beginning clean enough to be followed, and an ending they would never forget. The folder, that simple rectangle of paper, was less a surprise than a sign that I had accepted their invitation to theater and brought a script of my own. Clara's breath had shortened into quick pulls as she skimmed, then re-skimmed, then settled on a page she could neither deny nor negotiate into something prettier. Her eyes lifted, shiny and furious. I won't be humiliated, she said. Not here. Not tonight. Then sit, I said. Eat. Smile for the pictures. Host your guests. The candles are lovely and the turkey's still warm. No one needs to be humiliated tonight. People only need to be seen clearly. She swallowed, set the folder down as if it contained a charge, and remained standing because sitting would mean surrender. Fine. Standing suited the moment better. Outside, snow flurried past the window, catching in the hedges, frosting the black iron rail as if the world were pausing to listen. Inside, something old and heavy shifted its weight and clicked into a new notch. I sat across from them at my own kitchen table, sipping coffee and listening patiently. Clara's voice carried that familiar edge, the same one she used when she was 12 and accused me of ruining her life because I wouldn't buy her an expensive phone. Byron added fuel, nodding gravely as if he was the one carrying the burden of the house's supposed decay. When they finally stopped, I set my cup down and told them plainly that they had lived here rent-free for years, that any maintenance issues were their responsibility, and that I wasn't about to hand over money for what I knew were frivolous desires. The shift in the room was instant. Clara's lips tightened into a thin line. "So you're just going to let the house rot while you sit here doing nothing?" she snapped. Byron leaned back in his chair, smirking slightly as if enjoying the show. "You've always been like this," Clara continued, her voice rising. "Selfish. A roadblock to our future. You don't care about family unless it benefits you." I could have reminded her of the countless times I'd bailed them out, the rent I covered when Byron's last business failed, the down payment I gave for their car, the credit card debt I quietly paid off so they wouldn't drown in interest. But I didn't. I'd learned long ago that listing my sacrifices only made her feel cornered, and cornered people lash out harder. Instead, I told her she was free to make whatever choices she wanted for her own life, but my answer about the money wouldn't change. That was when the real venom showed. She accused me of resenting her success, of trying to hold her back, because I was afraid she might actually surpass me. Byron, ever the co-conspirator, chimed in about how a real man would want to see his daughter thrive. They spoke about the house as though it were already theirs, debating out loud how they would renovate the living room and replace the furniture. My refusal was an inconvenience, not a boundary. I sat there, letting them play out their fantasy, because every word they spoke told me more about what this was really about. It wasn't a house to them. It was leverage, and they were trying to push me into surrendering it without realizing I was seeing through every word. When they finally left, Clara slammed the door behind her. I stood in the quiet kitchen for a long time, staring at the empty chairs. The door clicked softly behind me, shutting out the rest of the house. This room had been my refuge for decades, a place where the outside world couldn't intrude. I sat on the edge of the bed, the old springs groaning under my weight, and glanced toward the nightstand. My hand moved almost automatically to the top drawer, sliding it open to reveal an old leather-bound photo album. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling, the edges frayed, but the memories inside were sharp as ever. I flipped it open and was greeted by a photograph of Clara at 6 years old, missing her 2 front teeth and clutching a ragged stuffed rabbit. Her smile was wide, pure, and untainted by the greed-eyed scene in her eyes earlier that day. I remembered the day clearly. We'd gone to the county fair, just the two of us. I had spent hours with her, winning that rabbit at a ring toss booth after more tries than I cared to admit. She'd hugged me so tight, I thought she might never let go. My throat tightened as I turned the page. There was another picture, this one of Clara at 16, standing proudly in her soccer uniform. I'd sold my old pickup truck to pay for her team's travel expenses to a tournament out of state. I remembered lying to her mother, telling her the truck needed too many repairs, when the truth was I'd just wanted Clara to have that chance to shine. She'd scored the winning goal in the final match, running across the field into my arms, telling me I was the best dad in the world. I believed it then. I kept turning pages, each one a reminder of the sacrifices I had made without hesitation. The late nights working overtime to pay her college tuition, the summer vacations I gave up so she could go to study abroad, the loans I quietly paid off without ever asking for thanks. And then I reached the photographs from after she met Byron. Her smile was different in these, tighter, more practiced. In one, she was holding a champagne glass in a fancy restaurant, Byron's arm draped possessively around her shoulders. I remembered that dinner because it was the first time she'd hinted that my house might be too big for me alone, and how she and Byron could help by moving in and taking over some of the upkeep. Back then, I thought she was just trying to be considerate. Now I knew better. I set the album down and reached for another photograph, this one framed and kept on a nightstand. It was of Clara's mother, long before the illness took her. Her hair was soft and wavy, her smile warm. She had been my anchor, The person who reminded me to see the best in people, even when they disappointed me. When she passed away, something in Clara changed. Maybe it was grief, maybe it was Byron's influence, maybe it was both. But the distance between us grew wider, and I had filled the gap with excuses. I ran my fingers over the frame, feeling the slight tremor in my hands. That day in the kitchen wasn't just about money. It was about a daughter who no longer saw me as family, but as an obstacle to be removed. I leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and the memories kept coming. I thought about the winter Clara was 8 years old, when a blizzard knocked out the power for 3 days. I'd kept the fireplace going, cooked meals on a camping stove, and turned the living room into a fortress of blankets and pillows so she could sleep in warmth. She laughed, calling it the best camping trip ever. Back then, she believed I could fix anything. Now, she acted like I was the problem she needed to fix. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. The anger from earlier simmered into something colder: resolve. If she and Byron wanted to treat me like a burden, they would soon learn that I was anything but defenseless. I had built my life from the ground up, brick by brick, nail by nail, and I could dismantle their schemes with the same precision. But even as that determination grew, there was a deep ache in my chest. I wasn't just losing a house or control over my own life. I was losing the little girl who used to run to me for comfort, the teenager who once believed I was her biggest champion. And maybe, in truth, I had lost her a long time ago, and I had been too blind to see it. I set the photo of her mother back on a nightstand and closed the drawer. If they were going to come at me, I needed to be ready, and readiness meant having more than just memories and moral high ground. It meant proof, hard, undeniable proof of who they were and what they were really after. I began with what was in plain sight. One afternoon, while they were both out, Clara at her networking brunch and Byron off at one of his supposed business meetings, I walked into the living room they had claimed as their own. Their papers were scattered across the coffee table like breadcrumbs. Most people are careful with the parts of their lives they don't want others to see, but not Clara and Byron. They were careless, confident in the assumption that I either wouldn't look or wouldn't understand. I did both. I started with a thick white envelope from a credit card company, the logo stamped in bold at the top. Inside was a statement with a balance, so high it made my stomach tighten. The charges told the story: luxury hotel stays, designer boutiques, expensive restaurants, and an alarming number of miscellaneous charges in cities they'd never mentioned visiting. I set it aside and picked up another envelope, this one from a bank I didn't recognize. It wasn't a checking or savings account. It was a notice of overdue payment on a loan in Byron's name. The language was firm, the kind of letter that comes after several ignored warnings. Next, I found a glossy brochure for a beachfront condo, the kind of property that sells in cash or on risky credit. A sticky note in Clara's handwriting was stuck to the cover. We could flip this in 6 months. My jaw tightened. They weren't just reckless. They were gambling with money they didn't have, planning to drag me into the mess by leveraging the house I'd spent my life paying off. I moved carefully, making sure to slide each document back into place after I took photographs of them with my phone. I didn't need to take the originals yet. Keeping them in place would make Clara and Byron think they were still safe in their little bubble. But the deeper I went, the uglier it got. A crumpled receipt from a jeweler showed a purchase worth more than what I used to make in 2 months. A collection notice from a furniture store detailed a missed payment plan on a living room set they didn't even need. I remembered the smug look Byron gave me last summer when I asked about the new sofa, how he said they got a great deal. Apparently, the deal had been making promises they couldn't keep. I was halfway through a stack of loose papers when I found something that made me pause. A handwritten note in Clara's script addressed to B. It wasn't affectionate. It was a list, short, sharp bullet points. Dad refuses to give us money. Push harder. Use unsafe living conditions. If that doesn't work, talk to Evelyn's contact about guardianship. My fingers tightened around the page. Guardianship. They weren't just plotting to pressure me. They were planning to paint me as incompetent so they could legally take over my life. My first instinct was to confront them right then, but I forced myself to breathe. If I exploded now, they'd deny everything, destroy the evidence, and double down on their plan. No, I needed to stay calm. I took photos of the note, making sure the handwriting was clear, and put it back exactly where I'd found it. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house felt like an accusation. Every shadow a reminder that my own blood was sharpening knives in the dark. But fear was a waste of energy. Action was what mattered. The next morning, I went through the upstairs office while Byron was in the shower. I found his laptop bag on the desk, unzipped just enough for a manila folder to peek out. Inside were property listings, mortgage statements, and a typed proposal for a joint investment that listed my house as collateral. He had even signed my name at the bottom in a sloppy imitation of my handwriting. That alone could have sent him straight into legal trouble, but I knew this wasn't the moment to play my strongest card. I slipped the folder back and walked out before he could catch me. Over the next week, I kept collecting. Receipts, bank notices, personal notes. They all went into a hidden folder on my own laptop, backed up to an encrypted drive I kept locked in the garage. By the time I was done, I had a timeline of their financial recklessness, their deceit, and their direct intent to undermine me. I had enough to stop them in their tracks if I chose to go to the police or a lawyer. But there was something else I wanted, something that would make their collapse undeniable in the eyes of everyone they had convinced otherwise. I needed them to expose themselves in public, the same way Clara had tried to humiliate me at Christmas dinner. That meant playing the long game, letting them think they were winning while I set the stage. A few nights after I had photographed the guardianship note, I heard their voices drifting down the hallway from the den. The TV was off, the lights dim, and they were sitting close together, leaning in over Byron's laptop. I moved quietly into the shadow of the hall, stopping just short of the doorway, my back pressed to the wall. Their voices were low but clear enough to carry. "He's stubborn," Clara was saying, her tone clipped with frustration. "But he's slowing down, you've seen it. He forgets things. If we push that narrative, people will believe it." Byron gave a humorless chuckle. "We don't need everyone to believe it. We just need the right people. Once Evelyn's contact signs off on the guardianship petition, it's only a matter of time. And with that, the house is ours. We sell, clear the debts, and start fresh somewhere better." My stomach tightened as I listened to my daughter reduce my life to a financial stepping stone. She wasn't talking about helping me, protecting me, or even coexisting. She was talking about erasing me from my own story. "He's going to fight it," she said after a pause. "He's not just going to hand over the keys." Byron shrugged. "Then we make him look like he's lost it. Stage a few things. Misplaced bills, hide his mail, maybe accidentally have a neighbor see him in the yard at night in his pajamas. The more little stories there are, the easier it is for the big story to stick." I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I stayed silent, every word carving itself into my memory. Clara leaned back with a sigh. "We need to time it right. Maybe Christmas dinner? Everyone will be there. Public is better. It'll be harder for him to blow up without looking unhinged." And there it was, the exact moment they decided on the humiliation I'd already endured. I realized that Christmas dinner had not been a spontaneous outburst from an angry daughter. It was the execution of a planned strike. They had rehearsed it, agreed on the script, and chosen the stage. The folder I'd handed her that night had disrupted their performance, but now I understood the full scope of what they'd been trying to accomplish. Byron's voice took on a calculating tone. "We have to make sure Calvin's on our side. He's respected in the family. If he starts doubting Wallace's judgment, others will follow. Clara nodded. I'll call him. I'll say I'm worried about Dad, that I'm scared he's not safe on his own. Play the concerned daughter. People eat that up. They clinked their glasses, sealing the plan like it was a business deal. My fingers curled into fists, nails pressing into my palms. I could have stepped into the room right then and exposed myself, confronted them with the recordings I had on my phone and the photographs on my hard drive. But I didn't. The smarter move was to keep listening, to let them believe they were weaving their net while I quietly tied it to a post of my choosing. For another 30 minutes, they talked about logistics, how they could get access to my medical records, how to involve a lawyer without raising my suspicion, how to frame the house repairs as a health hazard that I was too proud to fix. They were meticulous, but they were also arrogant. They assumed my silence was ignorance, that my age meant slowness, and that my love for my daughter would make me blind. When the conversation wound down and Byron closed the laptop, I slipped back to my room without a sound. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee as they breezed past me, already dressed for whatever self-important errands they had planned. Clara gave me a perfunctory smile, the kind that didn't touch her eyes, and Byron muttered a quick morning without meeting my gaze. I watched them leave, my mind replaying their words from the night before. The anger that had burned hot when I first overheard them had cooled into something far more dangerous: clarity. I now knew the precise angle of their attack, the allies they were courting, the lies they intended to tell, and the moment they planned to deliver the final blow. That knowledge was a map, and with it, I could chart my own countermoves. I spent the rest of the day tightening my preparations. I backed up the audio recording from the night before onto 2 separate encrypted drives. I labeled it in a way only I would understand and hid 1 copy in the false bottom of my desk drawer. I also began drafting a list of people I could trust, individuals who had known me for years, who could vouch for my mental sharpness and independence. If Clara wanted to use family gatherings to sway public opinion, I would have my own witnesses ready. And more importantly, I would let her think her plan was still in motion. It's a strange thing to realize your enemy lives under your roof and shares your blood. It strips away any illusions about loyalty and forces you to see relationships for what they truly are: choices, not obligations. Clara and Byron had made their choice. I was making mine. I decided that when the moment came, I wouldn't simply block their attack. I would turn it back on them so completely that they would never dare try again. And when they looked around for sympathy, they would find none, because I would expose them in the same public forum they had chosen for me. These were people Clara and Byron couldn't dismiss as biased simply because they liked me. They had credibility, and I needed their voices ready for when the time came. My first stop was Judith, my oldest friend and former legal partner before I retired. Judith had been in my corner through lawsuits, family disputes, and the kind of high-stakes negotiations that make lesser people fold. She was sharp, discreet, and allergic to manipulation. I called her under the pretense of catching up, but when we met for lunch at a quiet diner out of town, I slid my phone across the table and let her listen to the recording. She didn't interrupt once, just sat back with her coffee and listened, her eyes narrowing a little with each passing minute. When it ended, she exhaled slowly and said, "Wallace, they're playing a dirty game, and they're going to regret it." That was exactly what I needed to hear. She promised to document everything she had observed about me in the past few years. My clear memory, my ability to manage complex tasks, my independence, and to be ready to speak to it if ever called upon. Judith was my first anchor. My next stop was my neighbor, Rufus, a retired contractor who had lived across the street for 20 years. He'd seen me climb ladders, repair my own gutters, mow my lawn in the summer heat, and shovel my driveway after a blizzard without help. If Clara and Byron tried to claim I was physically or mentally incapable, Rufus could tear that narrative apart with firsthand stories. I invited him over under the guise of needing advice on a leaky faucet, and while we sat in the kitchen drinking beer, I told him the truth. He laughed at first, thinking I was joking, but when I showed him the printed transcript of the recording, his face turned grim. "You need me to tell people you're fine?" "Done," he said without hesitation. "Anyone who's seen you out here knows you're more capable than half the folks on this street." With Judith and Rufus on my side, I felt the foundation starting to take shape, but I needed more. The next call I made was to Foster's old friend Calvin, not to be confused with my brother-in-law of the same name. This Calvin had been around since Clara was a baby, had babysat her in his 20s when we were swamped, and had been at nearly every major holiday. He wasn't family by blood, which made him all the more valuable. His word would carry the weight of impartiality. I invited him for coffee at a local cafe, and after some small talk, I laid everything out. When I finished, he shook his head and said, "I always liked Clara, but that Byron. I never trusted him. You have my word, Wallace. I'll back you up in whatever way you need." The following days were a careful balancing act, strengthening my network while making sure Clara and Byron saw nothing out of the ordinary. I still joined them for the occasional dinner, still asked about their plans as if I were blissfully unaware, still smiled when they hinted at future changes. Every time they thought they were pulling ahead, I was quietly closing another gap. I even reached out to Evelyn, the lawyer Clara and Byron had mentioned. I didn't confront her directly. Instead, I scheduled a casual consultation under the guise of reviewing my will. The meeting was short, polite, and uneventful on the surface, but it gave me the chance to assess her. She was sharp but not unshakable. If Clara and Byron planned to use her as a weapon, I needed to know how she operated. I left that meeting knowing I could counter her if the time came. Beyond individuals, I also began to prepare a paper trail, a meticulous record of my daily routines, appointments, and responsibilities. I kept receipts for every grocery trip, every bill paid on time, every maintenance task I handled myself. I even began recording short video clips on my phone showing me completing tasks around the house, all time-stamped and stored securely. It might have seemed paranoid to an outsider, but in a fight where the other side intended to question my competence, there was no such thing as too much documentation. By the end of the second week, I had built a quiet but solid network of allies who could speak not only to my capability, but to my character. They knew the truth, they believed me, and most importantly, they were willing to say so if needed. Clara and Byron still floated through the house like royalty in waiting, smug in the belief that their plan was airtight. They had no idea that every smirk, every whispered exchange, every subtle maneuver they made was being countered with deliberate precision. I had no illusions about what was coming. It would not be a skirmish, but a full-blown battle for both my home and my reputation. But if I gave them just enough rope, they'd do the work of tightening the noose themselves. The trick was to play the part of a man beginning to lose his edge, but only in ways that seemed genuine and harmless. I started with small gestures. One morning while Clara was in the kitchen making coffee, I asked her if she'd seen my reading glasses. They were in my shirt pocket the whole time, of course, but the momentary look of triumph that flashed in her eyes told me she'd made a mental note. That evening, I forgot to put away the milk after pouring the glass, leaving it out on the counter for her to discover. Byron mentioned it in passing, his tone light but probing, as if testing to see if I'd get defensive. I didn't. I just chuckled and said I'd been distracted. These tiny lapses cost me nothing, but added fuel to the narrative they were building. I also began leaving open my mail, carefully selected, of course, on the kitchen counter. Bills with paid stamps on them, letters addressed to me from friends or official agencies, all left where they could be seen. If they thought I was careless, they'd start believing I might miss something important which would embolden them to take bolder steps. Meanwhile, every evening after they retired to their room, I go to mine and update my logs, add new photos, back up the recordings, and make detailed notes of every interaction. I kept a running list of every mistake I made, so when the time came, I could prove they were calculated, not accidental. After a week of this subtle play acting, I noticed their confidence growing. They whispered more openly in the den. They spent longer on the phone in hushed tones. Clara began calling Evelyn more frequently, her voice just loud enough for me to catch snippets about next steps and formal petitions. One night, as I pretended to watch television, I heard Byron in the kitchen on the phone. "Yeah, I think we're close. He's slipping up more every day. Evelyn says the paperwork should be ready by the end of the month." My stomach tightened, but my face remained relaxed, my eyes fixed on the flickering screen. Every word he said was another nail in their coffin. I decided it was time to escalate. The next day, I asked Byron for help with my laptop, claiming it was acting up. He took the bait, sitting down at the table to fix it. What he didn't know was that I'd left a decoy folder on the desktop labeled Personal. Inside were innocuous files, old grocery lists, scanned recipes, but I knew just seeing that folder would be irresistible to someone like Byron. I left him alone with it for 20 minutes, then returned, thanking him for the help and taking the laptop back. Later that night, I checked the access logs. Sure enough, the Personal folder had been opened, and several files copied onto an external drive. He thought he was being clever, but all he had done was give me digital proof of unauthorized access to my property. My trap was tightening, but I wasn't done. That weekend, I suggested we host a small dinner for a few extended family members, Judith, Rufus, and Calvin included. Clara lit up at the idea, no doubt seeing it as a perfect chance to plant seeds with people she thought she could sway. I made sure to invite them personally, explaining in private that this dinner was part of my plan. When the night arrived, I let Clara and Byron play host while I played the distracted old man, forgetting where I'd put the wine opener, calling Rufus by his brother's name, and mixing up the order of a story I'd told countless times. Each slip was deliberate, each one noted by my allies, who knew exactly what was going on. I watched from the corner of my eye as Clara pulled Judith aside, speaking with an expression of false concern. Judith listened, nodding sympathetically, all the while mentally recording every manipulative phrase Clara used. By the end of the evening, Clara and Byron were practically glowing with satisfaction, convinced they had won over at least a few guests. What they didn't know was that my allies left that night more committed than ever to standing by me when showdown came. The next morning, Byron mentioned offhand that Evelyn wanted to set up a meeting soon to discuss how to proceed. I feigned mild confusion, asking if it was about the so-called house repairs. He smirked and said something like that. I smiled back, my heart steady because I now knew their timeline. They were aiming for the petition to be filed before the end of the month, which gave me just enough time to set the final stage for their very public undoing. In war, there's a moment when you stop reacting and start directing. I had just crossed that threshold. The first step was assembling everything I had collected, the recordings, the documents, the photographs, and detailed logs, into a single, comprehensive package that would leave no room for doubt or denial. I worked late into the nights, poring over every piece of evidence with a fine-tooth comb, making sure dates matched, signatures were legible, and the chain of events was airtight. I wanted a folder so clear and undeniable that when it was laid before any judge, any family member, or any friend, the truth would shine through like a beacon. My legal allies helped me draft statements and affidavits explaining each piece of evidence and its significance. Judith, ever the meticulous lawyer, reviewed every page, flagged any possible weaknesses, and suggested ways to reinforce the case. We included a timeline that clearly showed how Clara and Byron's spending habits, reckless financial decisions, and manipulative behavior had endangered the family's stability long before they began their campaign against me. I also compiled letters from my allies, Rufus, Calvin, and even a few close friends, attesting to my mental acuity, independence, and capacity to manage my affairs without interference. Their words added weight and character references that Claire and Byron could not easily dismiss. Meanwhile, I prepared a formal letter to be delivered at the upcoming family gathering, a Christmas dinner where I knew they planned to present their narrative. The letter would expose their plan in detail, include the evidence I'd gathered, and make clear that I was not only aware, but fully prepared to fight. I worked on the wording carefully, balancing strength with dignity, exposing their actions without descending into bitterness or anger. I wanted my words to be a scalpel, precise and cutting, not a sledgehammer. I knew that when the letter was read aloud, it would silence the room, shift the balance of power, and turn the family's sympathies firmly to my side. In addition to the letter and evidence, I coordinated with Evelyn, Clara's lawyer, but under a different guise. I requested a meeting to discuss updates to my own will and financial arrangements, making sure I had all legal protections in place to prevent any unauthorized changes. I wanted to seal off any possible backdoors Clara and Byron might try to exploit. I also arranged for a security upgrade to the house, new locks, surveillance cameras, and a smart alarm system. This was more than practical. It was symbolic. The house was my sanctuary, and I was not going to let them claim it without a fight. All the while, I continued my subtle performances of forgetfulness, careful to keep Clara and Byron convinced that their narrative was taking hold. But behind closed doors, I was nothing but focused and deliberate. I refined my plans with Judith, rehearsing how to present my case should it come to court or family mediation. I practiced keeping my composure even as emotions threatened to overwhelm me. I prepared myself not just legally, but mentally and emotionally for the battle ahead. When Christmas Eve finally arrived, the house was decked with lights and decorations, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. I could see Clara's confident smile faltering ever so slightly as she sensed that something was different. They had planned their grand announcement, but I was ready to turn the spotlight back on them. I tucked the folder and letter safely inside my coat pocket, feeling the weight of truth and justice against my side. I knew this was more than a confrontation. It was a reckoning. That night, as the family gathered around the oak table that had seen decades of celebrations and arguments alike, I waited quietly, letting the moment build. When Clara began to speak, I let her finish, her words dripping with false concern and rehearsed authority. Then, when the room was silent, I reached into my coat and pulled out the folder. The look of surprise that crossed Clara's face was almost worth the years of pain. I opened it slowly, deliberately, and began to lay out the truth for everyone to see. The debts, the recordings, the deceit, and the cold calculation behind every betrayal. The gasps and murmurs grew louder with each page I revealed. Clara and Byron moved through the room like victors already crowned, their smiles practiced and eyes gleaming with anticipation. They believed the petition they had filed, the stories they had spun about my supposed incompetence, and the whispers they'd spread throughout the family would culminate in a triumphant moment, my public defeat. I sat quietly at the table, the folder containing the culmination of weeks of work resting beneath my chair. My hands were steady, my mind clear. I wasn't the broken man they portrayed. I was the architect of their undoing. As the guests settled in, familiar faces lit by the glow of candles and Christmas lights, Clara stood to address the room. Her voice was firm, rehearsed, laced with false concern. Thank you all for coming. Tonight is about family, but it's also about difficult truths. My father is no longer capable of managing this household or his affairs, and for everyone's sake, we have taken steps to protect him." A hush fell over the room. The words landed heavy, and I could see the ripple of shock pass through the crowd. Clara's eyes locked on mine, daring me to challenge her. I stood slowly, chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. "Is that so, Clara?" My voice was calm, but there was an undeniable steel beneath it. I reached down and pulled the folder from under my chair, holding it out. "If that is what you believe, then I invite you, and everyone here, to read this." The room leaned in as I opened the folder and began to lay out the evidence. The debts, the financial recklessness, the recorded conversations plotting against me, and the plans to declare me unfit. I watched faces shift from confusion to disbelief, then to anger as the truth unfolded before them. Byron's smug expression dissolved, replaced by nervous glances. Clara's carefully maintained composure cracked as guests whispered and pointed to the pages in shock. My cousin Calvin stood abruptly, holding a printed transcript. "Is this true, Clara?" he demanded, his voice firm and loud enough for all to hear. Clara stammered, "It's not what it looks like. We only wanted what was best for him." "Best?" Rufus, my neighbor, interjected, stepping forward. "It sounds like you wanted to take everything and paint him as a villain to do it." Several guests nodded, murmuring agreement. Judith, seated nearby, cleared her throat and spoke with quiet authority. "I have known Wallace for decades. He is sharp, responsible, and more than capable of managing his affairs. These accusations are not only false, but malicious." The room's energy shifted dramatically. The people who had been on the fence were now firmly on my side. Byron tried to speak, but was drowned out by voices demanding explanations and apologies. Clara's face flushed crimson as she tried to salvage her dignity, but it was slipping through her fingers like sand. The once orderly table was now a battlefield of accusations, spilled wine, and shattered trust. I took a step back, letting the chaos unfold around me. I didn't need to shout or argue. The truth was my strongest weapon. This moment was not just about winning back my home. It was about reclaiming my dignity and exposing the depth of betrayal from those I once called family. As the guests began to depart, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others offering quiet support, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth was finally out, sorrow for the fractures it had caused. Clara and Byron's betrayal had carved deep wounds, not just in the walls of the house, but in the heart of what I thought family meant. Yet, amid the wreckage, I found a strange peace settling over me. The fight had not been for vengeance or bitterness, but for truth and respect. I spent the days that followed going through the remnants of what was once a shared life, gathering memories and mementos, packing away fragments of a past that was no longer safe to inhabit. The house, with all its creaking floors and faded wallpaper, was more than a structure. It was a repository of decades of laughter, tears, and love. But I knew some chapters had to close for new ones to begin. I made the difficult decision to sell the house. It was not a defeat, but a release, a way to let go of a place that had become a battleground and to make room for a future unburdened by the weight of betrayal. The sale was swift, the paperwork signed with a sense of finality that felt both heavy and liberating. The new owners, a young family full of hope and promise, would breathe new life into the walls I had once called home. I moved to a modest apartment in the city, a space smaller and simpler, but filled with light and possibility. From my window, the city skyline stretched out like a canvas of endless opportunity, its lights twinkling against the darkening sky as if signaling a new beginning. In that quiet space, I began to write a letter to Clara. It was neither an apology nor a plea, but a statement of truth and forgiveness, a gift to both of us. I wrote of my love that had never wavered, my hopes that she would one day see beyond anger and greed, and my decision to release the past so I could move forward. Forgiveness was not for her. It was for me, a way to shed the bitterness and reclaim my own peace. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into an envelope, knowing that whether she read it or not, the words had already done their work within me. Life after that Christmas was quieter, but it was also freer. I rekindled old friendships and nurtured new ones, surrounded myself with people who valued honesty and kindness, and embraced hobbies and passions that had long been set aside. The scars left by Clara and Byron's betrayal remained, but they were reminders of my resilience rather than my pain. I learned that family is not solely defined by blood or shared history, but by trust, respect, and the willingness to stand for each other in truth. The house that had once symbolized security and love had become a prison, but stepping away allowed me to find a home within myself. One evening, as snow fell gently outside my apartment window, I sat with a cup of tea and watched the city lights flicker through the flakes. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil I had endured, but inside there was warmth and calm. I knew that life would continue to bring challenges and unexpected turns, but I was ready. I'd been broken, yes, but also rebuilt, stronger, wiser, and with a heart open enough to hope again. The past was a place to visit, not to live in. And with that understanding, I took my first steps toward a future unshaped by betrayal, but defined by possibility. The end. If you enjoyed hearing my story, please give this video a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd really love to know what you think about how everything unfolded. Did you expect the twist? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know. Your support and thoughts mean a lot to me as I share these experiences.